Ladies and gentlemen, from myself and my research team, I would like to present this status of lighting on pedestrian crossings. Lighting is important, obviously, for safety, and I would like to explain why it's important to study this, and then I want to talk you through the methodology which we developed specifically to assess the state of lighting at pedestrian crossings. So there will be an identification, evaluation, and recommendation on what to do to improve things. And I will give you the results of our lighting inspection and finally conclusions. The best recommendation as to why we should inspect lighting, well, it's accident statistics. In Warsaw, almost every 10th pedestrian accident ends in the pedestrian's death. The audits started in 2016, and from that moment on, and you can see it in the statistics, the number of fatal accidents is going down. And obviously, you cannot directly attribute it to our audit, but it is quite likely that the audits and the recommendations that were implemented subsequently have improved the safety. We know that during nighttime the likelihood of an accident increases by 30%, and when it comes to pedestrian accidents, that increases by 200% because of higher speeds, and visibility is not much poorer. Well, at a pedestrian crossing, to be able to see pedestrians properly, well, a lot depends on lighting and its condition. But the likelihood of a pedestrian crossing at a pedestrian crossing goes down by 60% and by 300% when it comes to fatal accidents. So this suggests that it makes every sense to provide lighting at pedestrian crossings. There were 18 districts covered by this. 12 have already been covered. All in all, it's more than 4,000 pedestrian crossings that we've already covered. So I think you can see the economies of scale here, because this is a big enough number to draw conclusions. Now, the methodology and how we worked in the field. We had teams of 3 or 4 people, one of them as the luminance expert. The procedures for all the teams are uniform to ensure that the measurements and conclusions are consistent, and each team member has their specific function. Could be measuring lighting or data recording, taking photographs, recording the results or comments. In terms of the equipment, we have a luxometer, top class, A or B, and we also use these lengthening elements not to cover up the device. And there are several steps in the measurements that we do. Well, first of all, we work in the field, and when we're out there, we measure lighting intensity horizontally and vertically. We do photographic documentation, pedestrian crossing geometry, and something really important, subjective evaluation of the auditing team at the given point in time. And then the data, which are recorded, are then further processed, where we calculate indicators This leads to an objective evaluation, and the end result, in fact, is a summary of objective and subjective evaluations. We then develop a list of recommendations on the things to do to improve lighting, and then a ranking list to show the sites that are good or not so good. That way it's easier to identify the pedestrian crossings that need improvement. And can I just stress the importance of the subjective assessment, for example, observing a pedestrian silhouette, or perhaps something really covers up the lighting, such as tree branches. So that's part of the subjective assessment. But what's really important is to measure lighting parameters, and that happens at two levels. Horizontally at 30 points, and vertically 10 points for each side of oncoming vehicles. And so all in all, it's 50 points vertically, which really says a lot about the quality of lighting. And the final score on the objective evaluation really depends on the measurements and how they fit into lighting classes. Each class has a specific score, and so the end result of the objective evaluation is based on calculation, and in fact it's weighted average with the weight coefficient, a weight factor at 0.33. And the final ranking is the sum of the subjective and objective evaluation with the weight factor at 0.5. And this is the final ranking for a particular pedestrian crossing and its lighting. We record all the data in the lighting measurement card. This is then input into the database, and we can generate reports from the database, and the reports can be arranged by districts or pedestrian crossings, and the report will give you all the details such as lighting, intensity, or anything else that we studied. Here are some examples of the results. So, for example, the intensity of horizontal lighting and the class it fits into. Well, 36% are not part of any category, which means it's pretty dark out there. And for C0, only 5% of the crossings have scored that. Obviously, in between, there are lots of results where you can better see the pedestrian. Now, summary of the assessments. And again, the distribution here is like the classical Gaussian curve. So this is relatively good levels. Some of the things we can improve using simple measures, but some of quite a big proportion of the pedestrian crossings range between 0 to 1, which means urgent action is needed. Well, here's an example. Average horizontal light intensity for different districts. The average is around 20 luxes, but between Żoliborz and Praga Południe, the two extreme districts, the distance is big. Żoliborz is double that of Praga Południe. Now, the length of the pedestrian crossing and the level of lighting on the crossing. For long pedestrian crossings, and obviously you probably shouldn't have them in the first place, but once long sections are there, more lighting is required because the pedestrians spend so much more time crossing that crossing, and the hazards or the risk of an accident increases. Our recommendations. After we've collected the data and conducted the site visit, only 3% of the pedestrian crossings are good and no action is required. But the interesting bit is that a very high percent, in fact the majority of crossings, only requires simple maintenance maintenance measures. And if they were conducted on a regular basis, the problem wouldn't be there. And they can be easily improved, like to clean up the lamps or exchange light bulbs. Or, for example, when the lamp is dirty, it reduces the light intensity. When it comes to trees or vegetation covering up the light, then the light is distributed unevenly, that's not controlled, so that shouldn't be happening. Lack of lamp covers. You might think when you do your measurement, you think that there's more light because there's nothing covering, because there is no cover, but long term this could lead to damage to the light bulb in the first place. Just to explain why we think it makes sense to do the audits, here's a comparison of poorly lit and well-lit crossings. It's such a huge difference, up to 100 luxes to a fraction of a lux. And here's another example. On the left-hand side, this is a solution dedicated for one-way roads with very good lighting horizontally and vertically, where pedestrians can be seen very clearly. And on the right-hand side, pedestrian crossings which are so dark that our devices can barely measure any light at all. And finally, the most interesting question: what is the relation between pedestrian safety and lighting, and how do we ensure that a relationship is established? So we have a list of pedestrian crossings and accidents during nighttime and daytime, and what's the average level of lighting. It doesn't seem to be really clear-cut. It's difficult to establish the relation between lighting and better or worse safety. Take the district of Ochota, where clearly we have many nighttime accidents and the fatality rate there is pretty high, and it has one of the lowest levels of lighting. Next is Wesoła district, where 100% of fatal accidents happen during the night. And so, again, lighting has a strong effect on pedestrian safety at pedestrian crossings, especially during nighttime. Now, to summarize this, one thing is clear. We should be taking proactive actions. That's to inspect, control, and audit. And also, let me give you an idea of the scale of the checks. 4,500 crossings, that's a lot. It's not like every 200th crossing. It is quite a major group. And then implementing the recommendations and then monitoring that is really important. And Warsaw is doing this, some 300 pedestrian crossings are improved each year in Warsaw, but it shouldn't stop there. We also need to check the effectiveness of these solutions. We need to know whether pedestrian safety has actually improved there. So to have a full analysis, we need to have the other districts that we still haven't covered, and in the future, to be absolutely sure about the effect of lighting on better safety, well, for that, we would have to extract the lighting element only, and once we've isolated that, we can then analyze its effect on road safety, also, especially when it comes to pedestrian safety, because that's the whole point of the work. So what we should do is perhaps select some high-risk pedestrian crossings and then isolate lighting from all the other factors. Well, that's it from me. Thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak, and thank you for the efficiency in running this organization despite a different form that we're used to.